My phone started vibrating across the hotel nightstand at 2:07 in the morning. Dad, I answered on the fourth ring. Your apartment building is on fire, Robert said before I could speak. Hope you have insurance. There was no panic in his voice, no fear that his daughter might be trapped inside apartment 4B. If anything, he sounded satisfied. I sat up and opened the building monitoring app on my phone. One alarm, basement utility corridor, sprinklers active, fire department dispatched, all 12 units evacuated, everyone was safe. I stared at the screen, then I started laughing. Dad went quiet. Why are you laughing at a tragedy? Because he thought I was about to lose everything. What he didn't know was that I wasn't even inside the building, and apartment 4B wasn't the most important thing I had there anymore. Because, Dad, I said. Then I stopped. Something about his call suddenly bothered me more than the fire. I was 3 blocks away in a hotel because contractors were completing overnight electrical upgrades in several vacant units. Dad still believed I was sleeping in 4B, but that wasn't the strange part. The fire department had notified me only minutes earlier because I was listed as the property owner. Robert hadn't owned that building for months, so how did he know it was burning already? I think you just told me something you really shouldn't know. His voice changed instantly. What are you talking about? You called me before anyone else did. A neighbor called me. Which neighbor? Silence. I swung my legs off the bed and reached for my coat. Dad, don't start making something out of nothing, Ashley. I asked which neighbor. The call ended. I stared at the screen. For years, my father had treated me like the helpless daughter renting one of his apartments. At family dinners, he loved reminding everyone that I lived in his building, as if the roof over my head existed only because he allowed it. Tonight, he apparently believed I was standing outside watching that roof disappear in flames. But the fire itself wasn't what scared me, his timing did. I grabbed my keys and headed toward the elevator. Before the doors opened, another notification appeared. This one wasn't from the fire department. It came from the building's security system. I opened the access log. At 1:43 a.m., 17 minutes before the fire alarm, someone had entered the secured basement using an administrative code that should no longer have worked. I knew exactly whose code it was, my father's. So why had Robert Bennett accessed a building he no longer owned 17 minutes before it caught fire? By the time I reached the building, the fire was already under control. 2 engines were parked along the curb, red lights washing over the brick exterior. Tenants stood across the street wrapped in blankets while firefighters moved in and out of the basement entrance. I found the fire captain near the front steps. How bad is it? Contained to the basement electrical area, he said. Sprinklers did their job. No apartment damage, no injuries. I nodded, but before I could ask anything else, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Ashley! I turned. Dad was walking toward me. That stopped me cold. 20 minutes earlier, he had claimed some unnamed neighbor told him about the fire. Now he was here. He pointed toward the building. Stay out of the way and let the professionals handle this. I looked at him. Why are you here? He ignored the question. Then, loud enough for 2 tenants nearby to hear, he said, You're a tenant. Management issues aren't your concern. There it was. The same tone he had used for years. Robert Bennett had owned this 12-unit building for 23 years, and whenever his books became a mess, I was the one he called. I reconciled missing payments, tracked vendor invoices, caught late fees, and every time I warned him about refinancing the property to cover unrelated investments, he brushed me off. You understand spreadsheets, he once told me. You don't understand real estate. 6 months ago, I found foreclosure notices buried inside financial records he hadn't expected me to see. When I confronted him, he didn't explain them. He laughed. Maybe worry about paying your rent before you start questioning my business. That was the day I stopped arguing and started investigating. Back outside the burning building, Dad grabbed my elbow and pulled me a few steps away from the tenants. Whatever you think happened tonight, he said quietly, don't start making accusations you can't afford. I slowly looked down at his hand until he released me. I haven't accused you of anything. His jaw tightened. Before he could answer, a firefighter approached us. Mr. Bennett? Dad turned. We found evidence someone entered the secured basement tonight. How did you get access? Dad froze. I have keys. The firefighter frowned. You still have keys? Dad lifted his chin. Of course I do. I own the place. For the first time that night, I looked directly into my father's eyes. Then I reached into my coat, pulled out my security key card, and handed it to the fire investigator beside us. Check every entry made tonight. Dad's face changed. By sunrise, the sidewalk looked less like a fire scene and more like a public hearing. Tenants stood in small groups near the curb. Two of my relatives had shown up after hearing what happened, along with a former maintenance supervisor Dad used to employ, and Dad had already started working the crowd. The new owner let the place go, he said loudly. This is what happens when investors buy buildings they don't understand. I stopped beside my younger brother. He looked at Dad, then at me. Why do you care so much? He asked. You lost the building months ago. Dad's head snapped toward him. Stay out of this. That shut down the conversation for about 10 seconds. Then the fire investigator walked over holding a printed access report. Mr. Bennett, we confirmed an administrative code was used to enter the basement at 1:43 a.m. Dad folded his arms. Codes get copied. This one was assigned to you. That proves nothing. I stayed quiet. The investigator glanced at another page. Do you know Dennis Cole? Dad's expression barely moved. Name sounds familiar. Handyman. Did some work here before. Dad shrugged. Maybe years ago. A tenant standing behind us spoke immediately. That's not true. I saw Dennis here last night. Dad turned. What? Near the basement entrance, around midnight. For the first time, people stopped looking at me and started looking at him. Dad pointed in my direction. This is ridiculous. Ashley's angry because of the foreclosure. She's been bitter for months. I'm not framing you. You've been obsessed with this building since I lost it. That forced me to give the crowd one piece of information I had been keeping private. The building wasn't abandoned after the foreclosure. Dad laughed. I continued. The new owner has already spent thousands correcting deferred maintenance. The alarms were upgraded. The sprinklers were serviced. Every tenant is covered and temporary housing is available if anyone needs it. His smile disappeared. And how would you know what the owner spent? I met his eyes. I'm more interested in why you still had an administrative access code. Dad opened his mouth. The investigator cut him off. Mr. Bennett, Dennis Cole says you paid him to enter that basement. Dad's face tightened. I did not pay Dennis to start a fire. The investigator stared at him. Then he said very calmly, nobody said you paid him to start one. Everything around us seemed to go quiet. My brother looked at Dad. So did the tenants. Dad realized what he had just done. I meant because that's obviously what you're implying. The investigator didn't argue. He turned toward the basement. Our preliminary inspection found something else. Protective components near the electrical panel appear to have been deliberately bypassed. Dad's arms dropped to his sides. A few minutes later, Dennis's statement made things worse. According to him, Dad hadn't used the word fire. He had told Dennis to create an electrical problem, expensive enough to scare the new owner. That sentence connected months of strange behavior in my head. After the foreclosure, Dad had repeatedly asked who bought the property. When no one told him, he complained that outside investors were cowards. One big repair bill, he'd said once, and they'll run. I'd also learned he contacted the lender, asking whether the building might come back onto the market. Now I understood. He wasn't trying to destroy the building completely. He wanted to hurt the unknown owner badly enough that they would sell. What Dad still didn't understand was that there was no unknown owner. A black sedan pulled up. My attorney stepped out carrying a document folder. Dad actually laughed. You brought a lawyer? Yes. You don't have any authority here, Ashley. I ignored him and turned to the investigator. Are all the tenants safe? Yes. Fire contained? Yes. I looked toward Dad. Can he leave? The investigator shook his head. Mr. Bennett needs to remain available. Police are on their way. Dad stared at me as if he couldn't understand why anyone was answering my questions. Then one of the electrical contractors approached. Ms. Bennett, once investigators release the basement, do you want us to start repairs immediately? Dad slowly turned toward me. His face went blank. Why is he asking you? I opened my mouth. My attorney stepped beside me. I think this is the point where your father needs to know who AB Property Holdings belongs to. Dad looked from my attorney to me. What is he talking about? I took the folder from my attorney and opened it. A B Property Holdings is mine. Dad stared at me. No. Yes. His voice rose. You couldn't have bought this building. I did. The silence around us was immediate. For years, Dad had told everyone I was the daughter who rented from him because I couldn't afford anything better. Now he was standing outside the building he had lost, discovering that I owned it. 6 months earlier, when I found the foreclosure notices, I kept digging. Dad had refinanced the property multiple times and used the money to cover failed investments. Eventually, he stopped making required payments while continuing to tell our family that everything was fine. Once I understood how bad things were, I contacted the lender myself. I didn't rescue Dad. I had spent too many years cleaning up financial problems he created while he took credit for being the businessman in the family. Instead, I had the property professionally inspected, secured independent financing, and purchased it through AB Property Holdings, LLC. Dad knew a company had bought his building. He just never discovered the company belonged to me. I had kept it that way deliberately. I knew what he was like when he felt control slipping away. After the purchase, I replaced locks, upgraded the alarm system, serviced the sprinklers, installed cameras, and began fixing years of neglected maintenance. Those upgrades were the reason 12 families were standing safely outside that morning instead of watching the entire building burn. The investigator approached my attorney with another update. Security footage showed Dennis entering the basement. The access records matched Dad's old administrative credentials. Investigators also had Dennis's statement and payment records connecting him to Dad. Later, messages between them would show Dad discussing a repair problem severe enough to make the new owner walk away. And then there was Dad's phone call to me at 2:07 a.m. He had known far too much, far too early. Dad shook his head. I never told him to burn the building. You told him to damage an electrical system underneath 12 occupied apartments. I just wanted the owner to take a loss. I pointed toward the tenants standing across the street. There were families sleeping above that basement. His eyes moved toward them. Nobody defended him. Then Dad looked back at me. You bought my building? I closed the folder. No, I bought the building you lost. My brother lowered his head. After a moment, he said quietly, Ashley, I'm sorry. I looked at him. For what? For believing him when he said you depended on him. Dad turned toward him. Don't start. But nobody was listening to Dad anymore. The tenants learned that I was the owner who had paid for the new safety systems. Several of them came over to thank me before leaving for temporary housing. Dad lost every remaining form of access to the property that morning. My attorney began pursuing reimbursement for the damage and related business losses. Investigators continued building their case against Dad and Dennis. I didn't pretend I knew exactly how the criminal process would end, but Dad was facing potential charges, serious civil liability, and something he hated almost as much as losing money. Everyone finally knew the truth. I repaired the basement. Every tenant returned safely. I replaced the remaining access systems so none of Dad's old credentials could ever be used again. A few months later, I moved out of apartment 4B, not because Dad had forced me out, because I no longer needed to live on site. I hired a professional property manager and kept the building as an investment. Dad no longer had access to my finances, my property, or my decisions. He had spent years calling me just a tenant. Then at 2 a.m., he tried to burn away my security and discovered I owned the entire building.